Can you solve this murder mystery? True crime. The footage used in this video has been deliberately selected to free your mind, and by not showing pictures of the people or places or anything to do with the event, will free your mind to an honest opinion and therefore will not sway your judgment in any way. Who was R. M. Qualtrough? William Herbert Wallace was a drab, colourless, boring man who lived a drab, colourless, boring life. He was thrifty and hard-working, mild-mannered and a little snobbish, soberly dressed and utterly respectable. His idea of a night out with the boys was his regular fortnightly visit to a local cafe to take part in chess tournaments. A party at home with his mousy wife Julia usually only consisted of the couple playing duets on the violin and piano. Herbert's meek and unassuring manner was greatly appreciated by his employer, a solid, dependable insurance company who employed him as a collector and agent. In 15 years in their employment, he had proved to be utterly trustworthy. He was diligent and he never pushed for promotion. His admirable personality qualities and those of his shy little wife made them ideal neighbours in their neat terrace house in Wolverton Street, Anfield, Liverpool. He was never known to show outbursts or bad temper. In fact, the jury at his trial decided Herbert Wallace had all the characteristics of a sadic, brutal murderer. His wife had been battered to death so violently that her brains had spilled out onto the floor. She had died at the hands of a man who deliberately laid a trail of false clues to throw the police off his scent. There was no real evidence to connect her husband with Julia Wallace's death. In fact, he had a near-perfect alibi. But then Herbert Wallace was a man who ordered his life with attention to detail. He was too good to be true. The jury's verdict seemed to be that Wallace was so absolutely ordinary that he had to be capable of great evil. In spite of flimsy police theories which hardly stood up to defence cross-examination, in spite of a complete lack of motive on the part of the accused man, in spite of a summing up by the trial judge who virtually begged the jury to acquit him, Wallace was found guilty of his wife's murder. He sat impassively in the dock when the verdict was returned. It was this same lack of emotion which had led him there in the first place. "I am not guilty. I cannot say anything else," he whispered to the court as the judge prepared to pass sentence. The judge, Mr. Justice Robert Alderson Wright, showed more distress than the convicted man, but he had no option under law. Shaken by the jury's verdict, he donned his black cap and passed the only sentence open to him at that time, to be hanged by the neck until dead. And the mystery man who actually bludgeoned Julia Wallace to death must have heaved a sigh of deep relief. He had got away with the perfect murder. The first sign that Herbert Wallace's humdrum life was about to be shattered came with a telephone call from a complete stranger to the City Cafe in North John Street, Liverpool at 19:15 on Monday the 19th of January 1931. Herbert Wallace was due at the cafe that night to exercise his rather mundane skill as a chess player. He was taking part in a tournament aptly named the Second Class Championship. But the 52-year-old insurance agent was not there to take the telephone call. A waitress answered the phone and passed it to Samuel Beattie, captain of the chess club, who explained that Wallace had not yet arrived. Did the caller want to phone back later? The voice on the other end of the line asked to leave a message for Wallace. The caller identified himself as R.M. Qualtrough and requested that Wallace should call him at his home at 25 Menlove Gardens East, Moseley Hill, the following night to discuss some insurance business. Beattie wrote the message on the back of an envelope. About the same time, Herbert Wallace was setting off from his home at 29 Wolverton Street to catch a tram to the City Cafe for the chess club meeting. The Wallaces had been married for 18 years after a 2-year engagement in their hometown of Harrogate, Yorkshire. Herbert had a worthy but lowly paid job as a political agent for the local branch of the Liberal Party. When the party funds could no longer support his salary, he moved to the quiet suburb of Anfield in Liverpool. Julia, 5 years younger than her husband, set about making their new home in Wolverton Street neat and tidy, just like their lives. In her earlier years, she had spent some time in the studies of music and painting, and a small upright piano took pride of place in the parlour of their trim terraced house. As Herbert settled into his new job as a collector of the Prudential Insurance Company, the childless couple could afford little luxuries like the £80 which Mr. Wallace had spent on a microscope. He prided himself on being a diligent amateur scientist. He even lectured part-time in chemistry at Liverpool Technical College, and often he and Julia would spend the evening in the little laboratory he had built just off his bathroom, where they examined slides on the microscope. At the age of 50, Herbert had even started to learn the violin and accompanied Julia on the piano. His job paid him an annual salary of £250, and the thrifty couple lived quietly within their means. Herbert had a bank savings account of £152, and Julia had her own modest savings of £90. As Herbert Wallace wrote his diary, he wrote, "We seem to have pulled well together, and I think we both get as much pleasure and contentment out of our life as most people." The only times he left Julia alone were his visits to the chess club and his lectures at the Technical College. But when he stepped out that night to catch his tram to the cafe, there was a nagging worry in his mind. There had been a spate of burglaries in Anfield in the past few weeks, and Wallace often kept large sums of his insurance company's money at home. "Don't open the door to any strangers while I'm gone, dear," he reminded Julia as he left. Samuel Beattie never actually saw Wallace arrive at the City Cafe, but shortly after the phone call he saw him seated taking part in a game, and he passed on Qualtrough's message. Wallace seemed puzzled by the telephone call. He did not know any Mr. Qualtrough. The address was on the other side of the sprawling Liverpool suburbs, quite outside his normal insurance sales territory. On the way home from the club that night, he quizzed other members of the location of Menlove Gardens East. Which tram should he take to get there? How long would the journey take? The following day Wallace set out, regular as clockwork, on his appointment rounds in Anfield, collecting a premium of a few pence here, paying out a claim of a few pounds there. He returned home punctually for his lunch at 1400 hours, and went back to work for the afternoon and finished in the evening at 1800 hours. While Julia prepared tea, Wallace went upstairs, washed and changed, and filled his jacket pocket with insurance quotation and proposal forms. At 18:30, their meal over, Julia Wallace answered a knock at the door. It was the milk boy, 14-year-old Alan Close. He handed Mrs. Wallace a pint container of milk, and she took it into the kitchen to empty the contents into her own jug, returning to the front door to give the boy the dairy's can. That was the last time she was seen alive. About 15 minutes later, Herbert Wallace left the house. He walked a few hundred yards and boarded a tram in Belmont Road for the first leg of his journey to Meet the mysterious Mr. Qualtrough. At 19:06, after travelling a mile and a half, he switched to a second tram in Lodge Lane. His behaviour was unusual for the normally reserved Herbert Wallace. He chatted animated to the tram conductor, Tom Phillips, about his high hopes of selling a big insurance policy at his destination. At 19:15 he arrived at Penny Lane and switched to a third tram to complete his 5-mile journey. He asked the conductor, Arthur Thompson, to let him off at the stop nearest Menlove Gardens East. "Don't know it," Thompson admitted, "but we stop in Menlove Avenue. Just ask around, it's bound to be near there." For the next half hour Wallace trampled busily around the streets of Moseley Hill. He found Menlove Gardens North. He found Menlove Gardens West and Menlove Gardens South, but no Menlove Gardens East. He knocked on the door of Mrs. Kate Mather at number 25 Menlove Gardens West, and she told him there was no Menlove Gardens East. He remembered his Prudential Insurance supervisor, Joseph Crewe, lived nearby and found his home and knocked on the door. He got no reply. He met Police Constable James Sargent on his beat in nearby Allerton Road and was advised to go to the local post office to check a street directory for Mr. Qualtrough's address. Wallace agreed. Then he remarked on the late hour. "Yes, almost 8 o'clock, the policeman agreed. There was no directory available at the post office, and Wallace found a newsagent's shop. He pestered the owner, Mrs. Lily Pinches, into checking the names of customers on the shop's newspaper delivery round, explaining his errand to her in great detail. "No," she confirmed, "there is no Menlove Gardens East." Wallace gave up and went home. He arrived back at Wolverton Street shortly before 2100 hours, and his neighbours, John Johnson and his wife Florence, saw him struggling with the handle of his back door. Finally he managed to get the door open and went inside. The Johnsons were still watching as Wallace emerged a few moments later and calmly invited them in. "It's Julia," he said flatly. "Come and see. She has been killed." Within minutes the police were summoned. Julia Wallace was dead. Her skull had been battered by 10 separate blows, any single one of which could have been fatal. There was blood everywhere. A total of £4 was missing from the little cash box in the kitchen cabinet. She had been killed, the forensic expert decided later, between 18:30 and 2000 hours that night. Herbert Wallace appeared to be the most unmoved by the sight of his dead wife. Later that night he left the murder house and moved in with his brother's family a few miles away. The detectives, meanwhile, moved into 29 Wolverton Street and tongues were wagging furiously. Why had Herbert Wallace talked of his business so freely to the tram conductors and total strangers in his quest to find Menlove Gardens East? Had he deliberately drawn the patrolling policeman's attention to the time? And who was R.M. Qualtrough, who called the night before and had lured him away from his home? If the address in Moseley Hill never existed, did R.M. Qualtrough exist? On the 2nd of February 1931, a week after the body of Julia Wallace was buried in Anfield Cemetery, Herbert Wallace was charged with her murder. Cautioned by police, he said simply and sadly, "What can I say in answer to a charge of which I am absolutely innocent?" The press headlines had become so sensational and strident that when the trial opened at St George's Hall 7 weeks later, even the prosecution made little objection to the defence request that no residents of the City of Liverpool should sit on the jury. The prosecution made much of a key piece of evidence. They had traced the source of the call from R.M. Qualtrough. By sheer chance, the call to the City Cafe the night before Julia Wallace's murder had to be routed through a telephone supervisor because the coin mechanism in the public phone box had been faulty. The call and the defect were duly lodged. The call had come from Anfield 1627, a kiosk in Rochester Road, only 400 yards from Wallace's home. Of course, Wallace was not at the cafe to receive the call from Qualtrough, prosecuting counsel Edwards explained triumphantly. For the same reason, Qualtrough couldn't phone back later to speak to Wallace after he arrived at the chess club, because Herbert Wallace, he said, was R.M. Qualtrough. Wallace, the man decided, had made the telephone call to himself and then sprinted for a tram and arrived at the cafe to receive the message he had phoned through as Qualtrough. His persisting inquiries of tram conductors, the policeman and the residents of Molesley Hill the following night were all part of the plan to establish his alibi, the prosecutor insisted. And Wallace's unflurried demur when he returned home and found his wife's body was the action of a man who already knew the murder had been committed. Herbert Wallace's defence counsel, Roland Oliver, outlined his case simply. His client had not committed the murder, and it was not for the defence to prove who had wielded the murder weapon. Wallace was not Qualtrough, and the defence did not need to establish the identity of the mystery man. Wallace made a fuss of finding Menlove Gardens East, he explained, because it was a break from his usual routine, a chance to earn the unexpected bonus of a sale. He was displaying an emotion that was rare for him, excitement. He had only reverted to character when he found his wife's body. He became placid and introspective. Wallace had no motive for killing, though, his own wife. By all the rules of criminal law, Roland Oliver was absolutely right. The police had no evidence, only suspicions. Herbert Wallace had to be presumed innocent. But on the fourth and final day of the trial, the jury took only an hour to reach their verdict: guilty. It is almost routine for a judge to express his agreement with a jury's verdict in complex tasking case. Mr. Justice Wright, however, did not even offer them a word of thanks for their efforts. He pronounced the mandatory sentence of death by hanging. The defence lodged an immediate appeal, and a week after he should have been hanged, Wallace was taken from the condemned cell to London to appear at the Royal Courts of Justice in the Strand. Far from the hysteria and prejudice of Liverpool, 3 judges sifted through the hard evidence against Wallace. After a 2-day hearing, they retired for 45 minutes and pronounced their verdict: appeal allowed, conviction quashed. Wallace left the courtroom free, but spiritually broken. 2 days later, when he returned home, Liverpool police pointedly announced that they would not be reopening their investigation into Julia Wallace's murder. The cruel implication was not lost on Wallace's hostile neighbours and his workmates. The insurance company gave him a desk job to try to shield him, and a year later he retired on a pension. In February 1933, just over 2 years after the death of his wife, Herbert Wallace became ill with a recurring kidney disease and died in a local hospital. 5 days later he was buried in Anfield Cemetery beside his beloved Julia. So who murdered Julia Wallace? Who was R.M. Qualtrough? There were only 14 people in the whole of Liverpool with the name Qualtrough, and the police interviewed and cleared them all. In the atmosphere of outrage which followed the murder, Liverpool police reached a single-minded conclusion that Wallace was guilty. Squads of detectives armed with stopwatches and timetables spent days riding on trams and walking briskly around Anfield trying to demolish the timings of events. Herbert Wallace had his own suspicions. In the long nights of lonely agony after his wife's murder, he wondered which of his small circle of acquaintances knew he was due at the City Cafe that fateful night and left the tantalising telephone message for him. Julia, he knew, would only have opened the door to a familiar face. Even facing the hangman's noose, shy Herbert Wallace could not bring himself to scream in righteous anger and point a forceful finger of accusation. He apologetically mentioned the names of 2 men to the Liverpool detectives investigating the case. Both men were in their early 20s and both were former employees of the insurance company. At different times they have both parted company from the insurance firm after the cash shortages were found in their accounts. On separate occasions they have filled in for Wallace on his rounds when he was ill. They knew all about his social routine and the chess club meetings, and they knew that on some Tuesday nights, as on the night Julia was murdered, the cash box in the kitchen could hold as much as £50. Indeed, when they stood in for him, they had been inside his home and had handled the cash box. Julia would have readily opened the door to them, knowing they were former colleagues of her husband. Police records show that detectives only interviewed one of these men, and even then accepted without question of his assurance that he had an alibi for the night of the murder. The police concentrated all their energies on the man they wanted, the mousy little insurance agent whom everyone so desperately wanted to believe was a murdering monster. So who do you think was the murderer? Let me know in the comments below who you think was guilty and your reasons why.